I showed up at my grandfather Silas's house with a plate of his favorite peach cobbler, but before I could even say hello, he grabbed my arm. His face was pale with a terror I had never seen before. "Get inside the closet, Maya," he whispered, shoving me into the dark, narrow space. "Hide right now." I did not even have time to ask questions before I heard the front door unlock and my mother's voice echoing through the hallway. "My name is Maya, and I am 35 years old. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever been the black sheep of your family. You will want to hear exactly how I destroyed their perfect little world." I stood frozen in the pitch-black space, pressed against the heavy winter coats that smelled strongly of cedar wood and peppermint. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Granddad Silas was 78 years old. He was a proud African-American man who had built a highly successful construction supply business in Atlanta from absolutely nothing. He survived the civil rights movement and decades of ruthless corporate competition. He was the strongest man I knew. He never bowed his head to anyone. Seeing him tremble in his own foyer terrified me more than the sudden intrusion. Through the thin wooden louvers of the closet door, I could see slivers of the hallway. The heavy thud of the front door closing was followed by the unmistakable sharp clicking of my mother Yvonne's designer heels. She never wore those specific shoes unless she was stepping on someone or preparing for a social battle. Following closely behind her were the lighter, hurried footsteps of my younger sister Chloe. Chloe was the undisputed golden child of the family, the one who could do no wrong. And bringing up the rear was the heavy, deliberate tread of Connor. Connor was Chloe's wealthy, white husband, a venture capitalist who always looked at our family like we were a charity project he was forced to oversee. I held my breath, pressing my hands flat against the rough wool of an old coat to keep myself steady. Why was my grandfather hiding me from my own mother? The answer came almost immediately, dripping with the kind of toxic disdain I had grown up listening to every single day of my life. "It smells like old grease and stubbornness in here," Yvonne complained, her voice echoing loudly in the high-ceilinged foyer. She sighed dramatically, a sound I knew meant she was scanning the beautiful antique furniture and finding it completely beneath her current social standing. It reminds me of Maya when she insisted on taking the city bus to that community college instead of letting us use her college fund to pay for Chloe's sorority dues. Always so dramatic and so determined to struggle like a peasant. Standing in the dark, I felt a familiar hot sting behind my eyes. I remembered that day vividly. I was 18 years old, holding an acceptance letter to a top-tier university. I was so proud, so ready to start my life. Then Yvonne sat me down at the kitchen table and coldly informed me that my tuition money had been reallocated. Chloe needed to pledge a top sorority at her expensive out-of-state university to secure the right social connections. When I cried, Yvonne handed me a bus pass and told me to figure it out. That was the exact moment I realized my sole purpose in this family was to be a sacrificial stepping stone for my sister. I dropped out of my dream school, worked 3 jobs, and eventually taught myself coding at night. I built my own life far away from their toxic expectations. They thought I was just a struggling app developer barely scraping by. They had no idea who I had actually become. "You know how she is, Mom," Chloe chimed in, her voice nasal and whining. "Maya always wanted to play the victim. Can we please just get this over with? The smell in this house is making me nauseous, and Connor has a dinner meeting at the country club at 7. We do not have time to stand around breathing in dust." I watched through the wooden slats as Connor stepped forward into my line of sight. He looked around the beautifully kept home with a smirk of absolute superiority. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair and adjusted his expensive watch. He walked over to the solid mahogany dining table that sat just outside the hallway and dropped a heavy leather briefcase onto the polished wood. The thud made me jump. "Do not worry, ladies," Connor said, his voice incredibly smooth and dripping with arrogance. "We are right on schedule." He snapped the latches of the briefcase open. The sound echoed in the quiet house. I strained to see what he was pulling out. My grandfather was standing perfectly still near the archway of the living room, his posture rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He did not look confused or frail. He looked like a man bracing for an impact he knew was coming. "The power of attorney is forged perfectly," Yvonne Connor announced, pulling a thick stack of legal documents from the briefcase. He tossed them onto the table with a casual flick of his wrist. "I paid top dollar for a notary who knows how to keep their mouth shut and look the other way." My blood ran completely cold. The cedar scent in the closet suddenly felt suffocating. I pressed my ear closer to the door, unable to believe what I was hearing. Forged power of attorney. They were standing in my grandfather's house, casually discussing a massive felony. "Once the old man is locked in the memory care ward tomorrow morning," Connor continued, tapping the documents with a manicured finger, "I will transfer his estate's $5 million liquid assets directly into my firm's offshore accounts. We will liquidate the property by the end of the month. And do not worry, Yvonne. I made absolutely sure the paperwork is ironclad. Maya will not see a single dime of this money." I clamped a hand over my mouth to stop the gasp that tried to tear its way out of my throat. $5 million. A memory care ward. They were not just stealing his money. They were planning to throw a perfectly healthy, vibrant 78-year-old man into a psychiatric facility against his will, just to get their hands on his lifetime of savings. My own mother was standing there nodding in agreement, while her son-in-law plotted to kidnap her father. The sheer scale of the betrayal was paralyzing. I stood in the dark, my nails digging into my palms, realizing that the family I had spent my entire life trying to please was composed of literal monsters. I pulled my phone from my pocket. The sudden glow of the screen felt blinding in the cramped darkness of the cedar closet. I quickly dimmed the brightness to the lowest setting and tapped the red record button. The screen ticked away the seconds, capturing the silent proof of my family's treachery. I pressed the microphone close to the wooden slats of the door. Every word they spoke was about to become a nail in their own coffins. Out in the hallway, the heavy shuffling of papers continued. Connor was pacing. I could hear his expensive leather shoes scuffing against my grandfather's vintage Persian rug. His voice, usually thick with condescension, was tight with genuine panic. "My venture capital firm is completely underwater, Yvonne," Connor said, his voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "The tech bubble burst on my biggest portfolio, and my investors are threatening to file federal charges if I do not produce their quarterly returns. I need capital. I need it yesterday. The bridge loan I took out is defaulting. If we do not transfer Silas's $5 million into my accounts by tomorrow morning, I am finished. I will be facing prison time." I squeezed my eyes shut. My brother-in-law was not the financial genius he pretended to be at every family gathering. He was a fraud, a desperate failing fraud who had decided that stealing from a retired African-American man was the easiest way to cover his own incompetence. "We are handling it, Connor," Yvonne replied. Her voice was ice-cold, devoid of any moral conflict. "He is an old man. He does not need that kind of money just sitting in mutual funds. He owes me for everything I have put up with as his daughter. Once I hand these forged psychiatric evaluations to the court-appointed guardian tomorrow, I will be granted full medical and financial control. The state will lock him in a memory care ward, and we will liquidate his entire estate." A wave of nausea washed over me. My mother was speaking about her own father like he was a piece of defective machinery ready to be scrapped for parts. She was willing to strip him of his freedom, his dignity, and his home just to bail out her golden son-in-law. I heard a heavy sigh from the living room, followed by the clinking of ice in a glass. Chloe had poured herself a drink. "We need this cash." "Mom," Chloe whined, her voice cutting through the tension with pure, selfish entitlement. "Connor's investors are breathing down his neck, and my credit cards are starting to bounce. If I have to cancel my ski trip to Aspen because of Maya's favorite old man, I will literally scream. The private jet is already on retainer. My friends will know we are broke. I cannot handle that kind of humiliation." I gritted my teeth in the dark. Chloe was fully aware that her husband was facing federal charges, and her biggest concern was a ski trip. "Just make Maya sign away her rights," Chloe continued, the ice clinking against her glass again. You are the executor right now, but she is still listed as a secondary beneficiary. You have to force her to waive her claim before the courts look too closely. You know how to break her mom. You made Maya sell her first car just to pay for my sweet 16 party. She always caves when you yell at her. Just make her give up her claim to his estate too. She does not need the money anyway. She is just a struggling app developer. The memory hit me like a physical blow. I was 19 years old working double shifts at a diner just to afford a beat-up Honda Civic so I could drive to my community college classes. Yvonne had marched into my room, demanded the keys, and forced me to sell it to a used car lot. She used the cash to rent a country club ballroom for Chloe's birthday. When I begged her not to do it, she told me that Chloe's social standing was an investment in the family's future, while my education was merely a hobby. I had walked 5 miles in the rain to get to class the next day. They still thought I was that same terrified girl. They thought I was weak. They had no idea that I had spent the last 15 years building a medical technology conglomerate valued at $800 million. They had no idea that the very software Connor's failing venture capital firm desperately relied on was patented by my company. Suddenly, a different sound echoed through the house. Slow, steady footsteps moving down the wooden staircase. Granddad Silas walked into the living room. Through the slats in the door, I watched him step into the light. He was wearing his favorite cardigan, his posture perfectly straight, his expression unreadable. He did not look frail. He did not look like a man suffering from dementia. He looked like a king surveying thieves in his castle. The frantic shuffling of papers ceased immediately. Connor quickly plastered a fake smile onto his face, stepping forward with a pen. Silas, Connor said, his tone shifting into a sickeningly sweet condescension. Good to see you up and about. We were just organizing some of your medical paperwork. Yvonne wants to make sure you are fully taken care of. I have a supplementary release form right here. It is just a formality. If you could just sign on the dotted line. Connor pushed the forged document across the mahogany table. Silas did not look at the paper. He did not look at Connor. He fixed his gaze entirely on my mother. Is this how it ends? Yvonne Silas asked. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that carried not an ounce of confusion. You bring a criminal into my home to strip me of everything I built with my own 2 hands. Yvonne stiffened. Her eyes darted toward the front door, then back to her father. The mask of the concerned daughter completely dissolved, leaving only raw venom behind. You are sick, Dad, Yvonne snapped, crossing her arms. You are confused and you are becoming a burden. I am making the hard decisions because you are no longer capable. Sign the paperwork. We are doing this for the good of the family. I am completely sane, Yvonne Silas replied calmly. And I know exactly what your husband's firm is going through. You think I do not read the Financial Times. You are trying to steal my pension to cover his embezzlement. I will not sign a single thing. Connor took a step back, his face draining of color. Chloe gasped, setting her drink down loudly on a coaster. Yvonne slammed her hands flat against the mahogany table, leaning aggressively toward her father. The veins in her neck bulged. Sign it, old man, Yvonne snarled, her voice echoing off the walls with terrifying cruelty. Or I will have the orderlies drag you out of here in a straitjacket by noon. The medical evaluations are already signed by a doctor I paid off. You have no legal standing. I will lock you in a state facility and they will drug you until you do not even remember your own name. Now sign the paper. I tightened my grip on my phone, making absolutely certain the recording caught every single syllable of her threat. My chest heaved with a fury so intense it tasted like copper in my mouth. I prepared to kick the closet door open and tear my mother apart with my bare hands. But before I could move, my grandfather did something that made the entire room freeze. Silas chuckled. It was a dark, slow, rumbling sound that echoed with absolute authority. He looked down at the forged documents on the table, then back up at Yvonne. You are too late, Yvonne Silas said, a quiet triumph settling over his weathered features. I already gave the master deed to someone else. I am Maya, 35 years old, squeezed into the dark, cedar-scented hall closet of my grandfather's house. Granddad Silas, 78, and a proud, retired African-American business owner had just shoved me inside with a terrified whisper. The front door unlocked before I could even ask why. My mother Yvonne strode into the house, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood. She was not alone. My golden child younger sister Chloe and her wealthy, arrogant white husband Connor were with her. From the dark, I heard Yvonne immediately insulting the home. "It smells like old grease and stubbornness in here." Reminds me of Maya when she insisted on taking the bus to that community college instead of letting us use her college fund to pay for Chloe's sorority dues. Connor slapped a heavy leather briefcase onto the mahogany dining table. "The power of attorney is forged perfectly, Yvonne. Once the old man is locked in the memory care ward tomorrow morning, I will transfer his estate's $5 million liquid assets into my firm's accounts, and Maya will not see a single dime." I pulled out my phone in the pitch-black closet and hit record. Connor's venture capital firm was secretly underwater, and they were using Yvonne's familial authority to steal Granddad Silas's lifetime savings to bail Connor out. Chloe whined about her lavish lifestyle being threatened. "We need this cash, Mom. Connor's investors are breathing down his neck. If I have to cancel my Aspen trip because of Maya's favorite old man, I will scream. You made Maya sell her first car to pay for my sweet 16. Just make her give up her claim to his estate, too." Silas walked into the living room completely lucid, refusing to sign Connor's supplementary release forms. Yvonne snarled, "Sign it, old man, or I will have the orderlies drag you out of here in a straitjacket by noon." Silas chuckled darkly. "You are too late, Yvonne. I already gave the master deed to someone else." The silence that followed my grandfather's words was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a violent storm. In the dark confines of the cedar closet, I gripped my phone so tightly my knuckles ached. I kept the camera lens pressed against the narrow gap in the wooden louvers, capturing every second of the implosion unfolding in the living room. Yvonne let out a sharp breath that sounded almost like a hiss. She stared at her father as if he had just spoken in a foreign language. Connor was the first to break the silence, his face completely drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. He lunged forward, snatching the forged power of attorney documents off the mahogany table. "What do you mean you gave the deed to someone else?" Connor demanded, his voice losing all its polished arrogance. He sounded frantic now, the smooth venture capitalist facade cracking under the weight of his hidden financial ruin. "Silas, that is legally impossible. You have been showing signs of cognitive decline for months. Any transfer of assets you made recently can be easily contested in court. We will have it reversed by a judge before the week is over." Silas did not flinch. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, looking at the white man who had just threatened to throw him in a psychiatric ward. "You can try, Connor." Silas replied, his voice steady and low. "But you will be wasting the very little money you have left. The transfer was not recent. I executed the paperwork 3 years ago, right around the time Yvonne started making those passive-aggressive comments about my memory slipping. You see, I built a business from the ground up during a time when men who looked like me were not even allowed to get a loan at a bank. I know a shark when I see one, and I smelled the blood in the water the day Chloe brought you home." Chloe let out a dramatic shriek, clutching her designer handbag against her chest. "Mom, do you hear how he is talking to Connor?" she whined, stamping her foot like a petulant toddler. "Connor is just trying to protect the family assets. His investors are calling him every single day. If we do not get this cash infusion, his firm is going to default and my name will be dragged through the mud. I cannot be married to a bankrupt man, Mom. My friends will destroy me." Yvonne finally snapped out of her shocked trance. She stepped right up to Silas, pointing a manicured finger directly at his face. "Who did you give it to?" she snarled, her voice trembling with absolute rage. "Who did you sign my inheritance over to? I am your only daughter. That money belongs to me. You owe me for putting up with your stubbornness all these years. Just like you owed me when Mom got sick and I had to handle the estate. I took control then, and I will take control now. You are going to tell me exactly whose name is on that deed, so Connor can have his lawyers rip them to shreds. Silas just smiled a sad, weary smile that spoke volumes about how much he had endured from his own child. The trust is sealed, Yvonne. It is ironclad and entirely out of my hands. I do not own the house anymore, and I do not own the investment accounts. I am just a tenant living off a monthly stipend. You cannot squeeze blood from a stone, and you cannot steal what I no longer possess. Connor cursed loudly, throwing the forged documents back onto the table. They scattered across the polished wood like dead leaves. "We are leaving, Yvonne," he snapped, grabbing Chloe by the arm and pulling her toward the front door. "We need to get back to the office and call the legal team. There has to be a loophole. There is always a loophole with these old family trusts. We will find whoever holds the deed, and we will bury them in litigation until they hand it over voluntarily." Yvonne glared at Silas one last time. "This is not over, old man," she hissed. Her eyes filled with a terrifying, vindictive promise. "You think you are so smart. I will find out who you gave my money to, I will destroy them, and then I will come back for you. Enjoy your house while you still can." She spun on her heels and marched out the front door, the heavy oak slamming shut behind them with a violent thud. The sudden quiet in the house was deafening. I stayed in the closet for a long moment, letting the reality of what I had just witnessed wash over me. My mother and my sister were actively plotting to steal my grandfather's entire life savings to bail out a fraudulent venture capitalist. They were willing to have Silas declared legally incompetent and locked in a facility just to maintain their luxurious lifestyle. Slowly, I pushed the closet door open. The hinges creaked softly in the quiet hallway. I stepped out into the light, the scent of cedar and peppermint clinging to my clothes. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely slip my phone into my pocket. Silas turned at the sound of the door. The rigid defensive posture he had maintained against Yvonne melted away instantly. He suddenly looked his age, his shoulders slumping as he let out a long, ragged sigh. He walked slowly over to the mahogany table, leaning heavily against it. "You can come out now, Maya," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "The vultures have flown the coop for today." I walked into the living room feeling like the floor was shifting beneath my feet. "Granddad," I managed to say, my voice cracking. "I heard everything. The power of attorney, the memory care ward. They were going to kidnap you. They were going to take everything." Silas nodded slowly, running a hand over his tired face. "I knew they were planning something," he admitted, walking toward his small home office off the side of the living room. "Yvonne has been circling like a hawk for months, asking too many questions about my bank accounts, bringing up my health to the neighbors. When Connor started dropping by unannounced, asking to see my investment portfolios, I knew they were getting desperate. A man does not act that desperate unless he owes money to people who do not accept apologies." He disappeared into the office for a moment. I stood there trying to process the sheer magnitude of their cruelty. I always knew my mother favored Chloe. I always knew I was the family scapegoat, the designated punching bag meant to absorb all of Yvonne's bitterness, while Chloe absorbed all her praise. But to attempt to institutionalize her own father for cash was a level of depravity I had not anticipated. Silas emerged from the office holding a thick manila envelope. He walked over and held it out to me. "Take it," he instructed quietly. "What is this?" I asked, taking the heavy envelope. The paper felt rough against my shaking fingers. "Open it," he said. I unwound the red string closure and pulled out a stack of dense legal documents. The paper was thick, embossed with the seal of a highly respected downtown law firm. I scanned the first page, my eyes catching the bold legal text. It was an irrevocable blind trust agreement. I flipped to the second page, reading the listed assets. The house, the stock portfolios, the high-yield savings accounts. All of it totaling exactly $5.2 million. I flipped to the signature page. I saw my grandfather's bold, sweeping signature at the bottom. But right above it, listed as the sole trustee and ultimate beneficiary, was my name. Maya Zora Washington. I stared at the paper, the words blurring together. "Granddad," I gasped, looking up at him in absolute shock. "What did you do?" I did what needed to be done, Maya, he said, pulling out one of the dining chairs and sitting down heavily. I saw how Yvonne treated you your entire life. I watched her take the college fund I set up for you and waste it on Chloe's vanity. I watched her make you feel small so Chloe could feel big. I knew that the second I passed away, Yvonne would take every penny I built and pour it into Connor's black hole of a business. She would leave you with absolutely nothing. So 3 years ago, when you launched your first software company and showed me that you had the brains and the grit to survive, I went to a lawyer. I transferred everything into a blind trust. You have complete legal control over this house and all of my assets. Yvonne cannot touch a dime without your signature. Tears spilled over my eyelashes hot and fast. I had spent 35 years feeling completely unvalued by my bloodline. Yet here was my grandfather placing his entire legacy, his literal survival, into my hands. "They are going to come after you, Granddad," I whispered, wiping my face. "Connor said he is going to find whoever holds the deed and bury them in litigation. He has corporate lawyers. He has money." I smiled, a sharp, cold smile cutting through my tears. The fear that had paralyzed me in the closet was completely gone, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming wave of righteous fury. Connor did not have money. Connor had debt. He had desperate investors and a failing firm. But I had capital. I had an $800 million fintech empire that I had built entirely in the shadows, deliberately keeping my family blind to my success, so they could never ask me for a handout. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a sharp vibration that shattered the heavy emotional moment. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. The notification read, "Chloe." I swiped the screen open. The text message was dripping with a sickeningly fake sweetness, a stark contrast to the vicious whining I had just listened to from the closet. "Hey sis," the text read, "Mom is hosting a mandatory Sunday dinner tomorrow at 5. She really wants you there. We have some super important family updates and we miss you so much. Do not be a stranger." I stared at the glowing words. The trap was set. They were panicked. They needed to find a legal loophole to access the trust, and they clearly thought bringing me into the lion's den was the first step. They thought I was just the poor, struggling sister living in a cramped apartment fixing broken code for pennies. They probably wanted to guilt-trip me into signing a medical waiver giving Connor authority over Silas's health care, assuming I would just fold under Yvonne's yelling like I did when I was 18. I looked up from the screen, meeting my grandfather's worried gaze. "What is it, Maya?" he asked, leaning forward. "They want me at Sunday dinner tomorrow," I said, my voice dropping into a deadly calm register. "Yvonne is trying to gather the family. She is going to ambush me." Silas frowned deeply, gripping the edge of the table. "You do not have to go, Maya. We can call the police right now and hand over the recording. We can end this today." I shook my head slowly, sliding the trust documents back into the manila envelope. "No," I replied, tapping the edge of the envelope against the polished wood. "If we call the police now, Connor will just hire expensive defense attorneys and drag this out in court for years, claiming it was a misunderstanding. I want them to feel exactly what they tried to do to you. I want to look them in the eye when I take everything away from them." I looked down at the phone. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I typed out my response deliberately, keeping my tone bright and compliant. I wouldn't miss it for the world. I sent. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked at Silas. The terrified woman in the closet was gone. The CEO had arrived. I had exactly 24 hours to prepare for Sunday dinner. I needed to call my corporate attorneys. I needed to run a full forensic background check on Connor's venture capital firm. I was going to walk into my mother's dining room and serve them a meal they would never forget. I did not shed a single tear as I pulled out of my grandfather Silas's driveway. Years ago, the realization that my mother and sister viewed me as nothing more than an obstacle would have broken me. It would have sent me spiraling into a deep depression, questioning my self-worth and begging for their basic human decency. But sitting behind the wheel of my car with the heavy manila envelope resting on the passenger seat, I felt nothing but a cold, absolute clarity. They had drawn the battle lines. They had decided that my grandfather's life and my future were acceptable collateral damage for their insatiable greed. I was not going to cry. I was going to war. I drove straight to the glass and steel high-rise in downtown Atlanta that housed the offices of my personal attorney. Andre was a brilliant, razor-sharp legal mind who had been with me since the early days of my company. He was a tall, impeccably dressed African-American man who navigated corporate law with the kind of ruthless precision I deeply respected. When my receptionist had frantically called him to say I was on my way with a family emergency, he had cleared his entire afternoon schedule. I walked into his corner office and dropped the manila envelope onto his expansive glass desk. I did not bother with pleasantries. I took my phone out, synced it to the wireless speaker sitting on his credenza, and hit play. Andre sat perfectly still as the audio filled the room. He listened to my mother Yvonne complaining about the smell of my grandfather's house. He listened to my sister Chloe whining about her Aspen ski trip being in jeopardy, and he listened with narrowing eyes as Connor, my smug, white brother-in-law, casually outlined his plan to use a forged power of attorney to drain $5 million from a healthy man's bank accounts and lock him in a memory care facility. When the recording reached the part where Yvonne threatened to have orderlies drag her own father out in a straitjacket, Andre clenched his jaw so tightly I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. I stopped the audio right after Silas revealed he had already transferred the deed. The heavy silence in the office was deafening. Andre let out a slow breath and picked up the manila envelope. He pulled out the irrevocable blind trust documents my grandfather had given me. He read through them with an intense, calculated focus, flipping past the asset schedules and the property deeds until he reached the final signature page. Silas was always a step ahead of them, Andre said, his voice quiet but laced with deep respect. This trust is ironclad, Maya. I know the firm that drafted this. They do not leave loopholes. Yvonne and Connor cannot touch his money, his investments, or his home. By transferring everything into this blind trust with you, as the sole trustee, Silas effectively stripped himself of any paper wealth. Even if Connor's forged power of attorney was legally recognized, which it will not be, it is completely useless. You cannot drain a bank account that no longer exists in the victim's name. I nodded, sinking into the leather guest chair opposite his desk. They do not know I am the trustee yet. Silas just told them he gave the master deed away. They are panicking. Chloe already texted me about a mandatory Sunday dinner tomorrow. They are going to try to ambush me. I suspect they want to force me into signing some kind of medical waiver or release form, assuming I am still the naive, broke girl they kicked to the curb 15 years ago. Andre leaned back in his chair, tapping a heavy gold pen against his desk. His expression shifted from professional outrage to deep concern. Maya, there is something else you need to know. Something that makes this Sunday dinner invitation a lot more sinister than just a simple ambush. He turned to his computer monitor and typed rapidly for a few seconds. He printed a document and slid it across the glass desk toward me. It was a printed screenshot of a private social media group chat. The group was titled, Right Family Updates, a sprawling chat including my aunts, uncles, and older cousins. I had been quietly removed from that chat years ago. Read the message Yvonne posted last Tuesday, Andre instructed, his tone dead serious. I picked up the paper. My mother had written a long, dramatic paragraph detailing how heartbroken she was over Silas's rapid mental decline. She claimed that his doctor had privately diagnosed him with advanced dementia. She wrote that Silas was becoming paranoid and aggressive, forgetting where he put things and accusing family members of stealing. But the most horrifying part was the final paragraph. Yvonne had written that I was exploiting his confusion. She told the entire extended family that I, her struggling, bitter daughter, had been coming around asking Silas for money. She claimed I was manipulating his failing memory to drain his small retirement accounts, to fund my failed app development projects, and that she and Connor were stepping in to secure his finances before I ruined him. My stomach plummeted. I read the words again, feeling a wave of pure disgust wash over me. She was projecting her exact crimes onto me. She was preemptively assassinating my character to the entire family, so that when she finally locked him away, everyone would applaud her for protecting him from his greedy, unstable daughter. She is laying the groundwork for a conservatorship, Andre explained, leaning forward. She is poisoning the well. In the African American community, respect for our elders is everything. Yvonne knows that if she paints you as an abusive granddaughter taking advantage of a sick old man, the family will completely ostracize you. They will not question her when she takes control of his medical care. They will thank her for it. She is using their love for Silas to mask her own theft. I placed the paper back on the desk, my hands remarkably steady despite the hurricane of anger tearing through my chest. She thinks she has covered all her bases. She thinks she has the perfect narrative. They are desperate, Maya Andre said. People only take risks this massive and sloppy when their backs are entirely against the wall. That audio recording proves Connor is the driving force behind this urgency. He mentioned his venture capital firm is underwater and his investors are threatening federal charges. So while you were driving over here, I had my forensic accounting team run a quiet deep dive into Connor's corporate holdings. Andre swiveled his monitor around so I could see the screen. Complex financial charts and red-flagged banking alerts filled the display. Connor has been lying to Chloe and your mother about the extent of his wealth for years, Andre explained, pointing to a severe downward trend line on the graph. His firm did not just lose a little money in the tech bubble burst. He is completely insolvent. He has been moving investor funds around to cover his personal lifestyle expenses, essentially running a high-end Ponzi scheme to keep Chloe in designer clothes and private jets. But the music has finally stopped. Andre picked up a fresh file folder and handed it to me. This is the real reason they need $5 million in cash by tomorrow morning. I opened the folder and scanned the highlighted financial summary. Connor's firm had taken out a massive high-interest bridge loan 2 years ago to cover his failing portfolios. The loan was structured with brutal terms, leveraging his entire company and his personal assets as collateral. Maya, Connor is not just broke, Andre said, his voice dropping to a low, triumphant pitch. He is actively defaulting on a $4 million bridge loan. He missed his final grace period payment on Friday. His creditors are done playing games with him. They are officially auctioning off his debt tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. If an aggressive holding company buys that debt, they can immediately seize his firm, liquidate his assets, and send the findings of his embezzlement straight to the Securities and Exchange Commission. He will lose everything, and he will absolutely go to federal prison. I stared at the financial documents in my hands. The arrogant, condescending white man who had sat in my grandfather's house and mocked my upbringing was nothing but a hollow shell. He was 24 hours away from total annihilation, and he was perfectly willing to destroy my grandfather's life to save his own skin. He thought he could outsmart us. He thought his privilege and his tailored suits made him untouchable. I closed the folder and looked up at Andre. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face. The pieces of the chessboard had perfectly aligned. My mother wanted to host a mandatory Sunday dinner to force me into submission. She wanted to parade Connor's fake wealth while stealing my grandfather's real legacy. She wanted a show. I was going to give her one. Andre watched my expression, a knowing glint in his eye. What do you want to do, Maya? I tapped the financial dossier against the glass desk. My voice was calm, steady, and entirely merciless. Buy it. I parked my car halfway down the immaculate tree-lined street, taking a moment to look at my mother's pristine suburban colonial home. The manicured lawn and towering oak trees projected an image of perfect, unbothered generational wealth. The driveway was already jammed with the luxury sedans and heavy SUVs of my aunts, uncles, and older cousins. This was Sunday dinner, a cornerstone tradition in our African-American family. Historically, it was meant to be a time of warmth, a gathering centered around faith, massive platters of soul food, and deep familial bonds. But under Yvonne's roof, Sunday dinner was nothing more than a theatrical stage. It was a heavily orchestrated production where my mother played the role of the benevolent, successful matriarch and used the audience to parade Chloe and Connor's supposedly flawless high society lifestyle to the rest of the bloodline. Today, however, I knew the stage was set for a public execution. Mine. I walked up the bricked pathway and pushed the heavy mahogany front door open. The immediate overwhelming aroma of baked macaroni and cheese, simmering collard greens, enriched with smoked turkey necks, and sweet candied yams spilled into the foyer. It smelled like my childhood, but the atmosphere in the room was chilling. Conversations dropped to a noticeable hush the moment I stepped into the living room. My extended family was scattered across the expensive cream-colored sectionals. Aunt Shirley, my mother's oldest sister, gave me a tight, deeply suspicious smile. Uncle Marcus simply looked away, aggressively swirling the ice in his glass. Yvonne's poison had already done its work. Her fake medical updates and whispered lies about me exploiting a dementia-ridden Silas had taken root. They looked at me not as a niece or a cousin, but as a predator who was abusing an elder. I kept my spine perfectly straight and my expression entirely neutral. I did not flinch under their judgmental stares. I knew the truth. Furthermore, I knew that as of 9 o'clock yesterday morning, I owned the very debt that was about to vaporize Connor's entire existence. I was not walking into a trap. I was walking into a cage where I held the only key. "Dinner is ready," Yvonne announced, sweeping out of the kitchen. She wore a tailored silk blouse and a massive, self-satisfied smile. "Maya, so glad you decided to show up. Wash your hands and find a seat." We filed into the formal dining room. The long table was groaning under the weight of porcelain serving dishes and crystal glasses. And there, sitting squarely at the head of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the patriarch of the family, a seat that rightfully belonged to Silas, was Connor. He was leaning back in the heavy oak chair, legs crossed, sipping an expensive amber bourbon from a heavy crystal tumbler. He wore a designer cashmere sweater pushed up at the sleeves, projecting an aura of relaxed, untouchable wealth. The sheer audacity of his posture made my blood run cold, but I forced my breathing to remain steady. I took the only available chair situated near the middle of the table directly across from Chloe. My sister was already busy flashing a new diamond tennis bracelet at Aunt Shirley, her loud nasal laugh piercing the room. "Where is Granddad today?" Uncle Marcus asked, passing a heavy bowl of cornbread dressing down the table. "I thought Silas was joining us." Yvonne sighed, a perfectly executed sound of deep maternal exhaustion. She placed a hand over her heart, looking down at her plate. "Dad is having one of his bad days, Marcus. He is so confused lately. He gets agitated around crowds." Connor and I decided it was best for his peace of mind to let him rest at home. It is breaking my heart to watch his mind deteriorate this fast. A chorus of sympathetic murmurs rippled through the extended family. Aunt Shirley reached over and patted Yvonne's arm. "You are a saint for taking on his care, Yvonne. It is a heavy burden." I picked up my fork, my face a mask of stone. Silas was not confused. He was perfectly sane, completely lucid, and legally protected by a multi-million-dollar blind trust that I fully controlled. Yvonne was actively burying her own father alive in the minds of our family, paving the way for his institutionalization without a single relative raising a red flag. Connor took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon. He set the glass down and locked his eyes on me. His gaze was dripping with absolute disdain. So Maya Connor drawled his voice loud enough to cut through the surrounding chatter and force the entire table to listen. "Are you still playing around with those little computer codes? Still a struggling app developer, living paycheck to paycheck?" I looked up from my plate, meeting his arrogant stare. "I am doing just fine, Connor." He let out a short, barking laugh, gesturing broadly at my outfit. I was wearing a simple, unbranded black turtleneck and dark trousers. It was an understated Loro Piana set that cost more than his monthly car payment, but to his untrained eye, it lacked the obnoxious designer logos he and Chloe so desperately relied on. "You could have dressed up for Sunday dinner," Connor continued, shaking his head with mock pity. "You are 35 years old, Maya, and you still dress like a college dropout. Chloe and I were just talking about maybe setting up a small charity fund to help you get on your feet. You cannot spend your entire life scraping the bottom of the barrel. It reflects poorly on the family." I watched him swirl the bourbon in his glass. He was drowning in $4 million of defaulted corporate debt. His creditors had auctioned his life away yesterday morning. My holding company had purchased that debt in a swift, merciless cash transaction. By tomorrow afternoon, my corporate attorneys would lock the doors to his venture capital firm and freeze his personal accounts. Yet here he sat lecturing me about financial stability. The irony was so potent, it was almost intoxicating. Not everyone can handle high finance, Maya Connor mocked, loudly leaning forward to ensure the aunts and uncles were hanging on his every word. It takes a certain level of intellect and a high tolerance for pressure to manage real assets. You just do not have the constitution for it. There is no shame in being average. Yvonne smoothly slid into the conversation, her voice laced with venom, masquerading as motherly concern. Just like you couldn't handle the pressure of med school, which is why we had to focus all our resources on Chloe. The entire table went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. I stared at my mother, the air leaving my lungs. The blatant rewriting of history was staggering. I had never failed out of medical school. I had been accepted into a top-tier pre-med program with a partial scholarship. But during my sophomore year, Yvonne had secretly drained the remaining balance of my college savings account to pay for Chloe's disastrous debt-fueled destination wedding to Connor. When the university demanded my tuition, I had no way to pay. I was forced to drop out completely devastated, while Yvonne told the family I simply lacked the discipline to succeed. "Eat your yams, Maya," Yvonne commanded, her eyes flashing with a dark, controlling warning. "And don't make a scene." I slowly picked up my fork. I did not yell. I did not defend myself to the aunts and uncles who were looking at me with undisguised pity. I calmly pierced a piece of candied yam, brought it to my mouth, and chewed. The absolute silence at the table stretched out thick and uncomfortable until Chloe awkwardly shifted the conversation to her upcoming ski trip. The dinner progressed in a blur of forced laughter and Chloe's endless bragging. I ate quietly, calculating the exact trajectory of the legal strike I was about to unleash on them. As the dessert plates were being cleared away, the atmosphere in the dining room abruptly shifted. Yvonne cleared her throat, standing up at her chair. The casual chatter instantly died down. "Family." Yvonne began, her voice adopting a somber, businesslike tone. "As you all know, my father's mental health has reached a critical tipping point. Connor and I have consulted with top specialists, and we are taking the necessary legal steps to assume full guardianship of his medical and financial well-being. It is a tragic situation, but we must protect him from making disastrous decisions in his confusion." She reached down to the floor and picked up a sleek leather portfolio. She opened it and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, complete with brightly colored "Sign Here" tabs. She walked around the large dining table, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, until she stood directly beside my chair. The aunts and uncles watched with bated breath, entirely complicit in their silence. Yvonne slid a legal waiver directly across the table, pushing it over the gravy boats and the remnants of the collard greens until it hit the edge of my placemat. She slapped a heavy silver pen down on top of the paper. "Sign this, Maya." I looked down at the document. It was a comprehensive waiver, legally drafted to force me to surrender any and all secondary beneficiary rights, trustee claims, or legal standing regarding Silas Washington's estate. "It relinquishes your rights to Granddad's trust," Yvonne stated, her voice echoing in the quiet dining room with absolute tyrannical authority. "Connor is going to manage his care and his finances from now on. It's for the good of the family. Now pick up the pen and sign it." The heavy silver pen lay perfectly still on top of the legal waiver. I stared at it for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the dining room. Every pair of eyes was fixed on me, waiting for the inevitable submission they had come to expect. They were waiting for the 19-year-old girl who had surrendered her car, her education, and her dignity just to keep the peace. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I extended my right index finger, placed it firmly in the center of the crisp white page, and slowly pushed the document back across the table. It glided smoothly over the polished mahogany, slipping past the sweet potatoes and the crystal water goblets until it bumped gently against Connor's heavy bourbon glass. "I am not signing that, Yvonne," I said, my voice perfectly level. My mother's face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. Her meticulously crafted mask of the benevolent matriarch flickered, revealing the absolute tyrant underneath. Excuse me. She snapped her hands, planting firmly on her hips. You do not have a choice in this matter, Maya. I am the executor of this family, and I am telling you to sign the paper. Before I could respond, Connor let out a long, patronizing sigh. He set his bourbon glass down with a sharp clink and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He looked at me with the kind of relaxed, practiced superiority that only comes from a lifetime of unchecked privilege. He was a white man sitting at the head of a black family's table, dictating terms as if he owned the very air we breathed. Maya, let us be adults about this, Connor said, his tone dripping with forced patience. We are trying to do this the easy way. We are offering you a clean exit out of a situation you simply do not understand. But if you want to do this the hard way, we can absolutely accommodate that. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his expensive cashmere sweater. Do not be difficult, Maya. I have a team of corporate litigators on retainer who handle hostile takeovers before their morning coffee. I can tie you up in litigation for a decade. I will freeze whatever meager bank accounts you have. I will bury you in so many legal fees you will be bankrupt by Christmas. I will ruin your credit. I will make sure you cannot even rent a studio apartment in this city. The sheer audacity of his threat hung in the air. He was casually promising to destroy my entire life while sipping my grandfather's liquor. Chloe sat next to him, swirling her wine glass with a smug, satisfied smirk. She looked completely thrilled watching her husband put me in my place. Connor is right, Maya. Uncle Marcus chimed in from the other end of the table. His voice was heavy with disappointment. We all know you have been struggling, but what you are doing to Silas is shameful. Your mother told us how you have been coming around the house hounding a sick old man for cash to fund your little computer projects. I shifted my gaze to Marcus. My own uncle, a man who had known me since I was an infant, was looking at me like I was a criminal. It is elder abuse, Maya, Aunt Shirley added, shaking her head in disgust. Yvonne has been in tears all week telling us how Silas is losing his mind and how you are taking advantage of his confusion. We love you, but we will not sit by and let you steal from your grandfather just because you refuse to get a real job. Connor is a successful financial manager. He knows how to protect Silas's assets. You need to step aside. I looked around the room, taking in the faces of my aunts, uncles, and cousins. Yvonne had played them perfectly. She had weaponized our family's deep cultural respect for elders, turning it into a shield for her own monumental theft. They had completely bought into her fake dementia narrative. They genuinely believed that Connor, the slick, wealthy savior, was stepping in to rescue Silas from his greedy, unstable daughter. They were actively cheering for the man who was 24 hours away from federal indictment. Not everyone can handle high finance, Maya. Connor mocked loudly, ensuring his voice carried to every corner of the room. It takes a certain level of intellect and a very high tolerance for pressure to manage real assets. You just do not have the constitution for it. There is no shame in being average. Leave the heavy lifting to the professionals before you get yourself into trouble. Yvonne smiled, placing a supportive hand on Connor's shoulder. Just like you couldn't handle the pressure of med school, she chimed in, her voice echoing with maternal condescension. Which is exactly why we had to focus all our resources on Chloe. We had to invest in the child who actually had a future. Eat your yams, Maya, and don't make a scene. You have embarrassed yourself enough for one lifetime. Just sign the waiver and Connor will make sure you get a small monthly allowance to keep you off the streets. The dining room fell silent again, waiting for me to break. They expected tears. They expected me to raise my voice, to argue, to desperately defend my character against their coordinated character assassination. They wanted a reaction that they could point to as proof of my instability. I did not yell. I did not cry. I calmly picked up my linen napkin and dabbed the corners of my mouth. I placed the napkin neatly beside my plate. The silence in the room grew thicker, heavy with anticipation. I reached down to the floor and picked up my designer bag. Connor had mocked my simple black turtleneck earlier, completely oblivious to the fact that my understated Loro Piana outfit and my bespoke leather tote cost more than his leased sports car. I unsnapped the brass closure of my bag and reached inside. My fingers brushed against the thick, glossy cardstock of the corporate banking dossier Andre had prepared for me yesterday. I pulled the heavy folder out and placed it on the dining table. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Connor. The smug, arrogant smile on his face faltered for a fraction of a second as I rested my hand on the dossier. "I don't need your financial advice, Connor," I said, my voice dropping into a register of absolute chilling authority. It was the voice I used in corporate boardrooms when I was about to dismantle a rival company. "But you definitely need mine." I pushed the thick dossier across the table. It slid directly over Yvonne's forged legal waiver, coming to a dead stop right in front of Connor's plate. Connor stared at the folder, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What is this?" he demanded, refusing to touch it. "That is your reality check," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "Your venture capital firm defaulted on a $4 million bridge loan on Friday. You missed the final grace period payment at midnight." Connor's entire body went rigid. The color drained out of his face so fast he looked like a corpse. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Chloe stopped swirling her wine glass, her smug smile instantly vanishing. "You have been running a high-end Ponzi scheme to cover your personal lifestyle expenses, and your investors are preparing to file federal embezzlement charges." I continued, making sure my voice was loud enough for Aunt Shirley and Uncle Marcus to hear every single word. "Your creditors auctioned off your defaulted debt yesterday morning at 9 o'clock. I smiled a slow, surgical smile that made Yvonne take a physical step backward. "Guess who just bought your debt?" Connor's eyes darted from my face to the thick leather-bound corporate dossier sitting beside his crystal bourbon glass. The supreme arrogance that had defined his entire existence for the last 10 years seemed to physically drain from his body. His hands actually trembled as he finally reached out and flipped open the heavy cover. I sat perfectly still, watching his eyes scan the first page. The air in the dining room grew so incredibly thick, you could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He flipped to the second page and then the third. His breathing became shallow and erratic. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. "What is this?" Chloe demanded, her voice shrill and grating as she leaned over, attempting to read the dense financial jargon over his shoulder. "Connor, what does that say? What is she talking about?" Connor could not speak. He was staring at the bottom of the debt acquisition contract. Right there, printed in bold black ink, was the signature of the acquiring party. My signature. Maya Zora Washington. "It means I own him, Chloe," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence of the dining room. "I own his defaulted $4 million bridge loan. I own the collateral he put up to secure that loan. Which means, as of 9 o'clock yesterday morning, I legally own his entire venture capital firm down to the very last paperclip." "That is impossible," Uncle Marcus stammered, dropping his fork onto his porcelain plate with a loud clatter. "You are just an app developer. Yvonne said you barely make rent on a studio apartment." That is the story Yvonne wanted you all to believe, because it made her look like the successful, benevolent matriarch. I corrected, shifting my gaze to my uncle. "I haven't been a struggling developer for over a decade, Marcus. I am the founder and chief executive officer of a medical technology conglomerate currently valued at $800 million. I let that staggering number hang in the air. $800 million. I watched my aunts, uncles, and older cousins try to process the figure. Their mouths literally hung open. Aunt Shirley looked as if she had just been struck by lightning. "You are lying!" Chloe shrieked, slamming her hands flat on the dining table. The silverware rattled against the plates. "Connor, tell her she is lying. She does not have that kind of money. Mom said she had to borrow money just to buy groceries. She is just trying to embarrass us." Connor finally looked up from the dossier. He looked completely hollowed out, like a man staring directly into his own grave. "She owns the patents," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The core algorithmic patents for our entire healthcare portfolio. Horizon, Digital Synapse, Medical, all of them. They all license their base code from Washington Tech Solutions." He looked at me, a sickening realization washing over his pale, sweaty face. "You are Washington Tech." "I am," I confirmed smoothly, leaning back in my chair. "And because I own the patents your firm desperately uses, I know exactly how badly your quarterly projections have been falsified. You have been lying to your investors for 2 years, Connor. You have been siphoning their capital to pay for Chloe's designer bags, the luxury leased vehicles in your driveway, and the private jets you flaunt on social media. You thought you were so incredibly smart. You thought you could just waltz into my grandfather's house, forge a power of attorney, and steal a 78-year-old black man's life savings to cover your federal crimes. The collective gasp from the extended family was absolute. Uncle Marcus stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Forged power of attorney Yvonne, what is she talking about? Yvonne's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving beneath her expensive silk blouse. The entire foundation of her carefully constructed reality, the perfect suburban life, the wealthy son-in-law, the successful golden child, was being demolished brick by brick right in front of her most important audience. Do not listen to her, Yvonne spat, pointing a trembling manicured finger at me. She is delusional. She is sick. She is making all of this up to turn you against us because she has always been violently jealous of Chloe. I did not even look at Yvonne. I kept my focus entirely on Connor. Your creditors were going to turn your files over to the Securities and Exchange Commission on Monday morning. I told him, my tone clinical and detached. I bought your debt at a premium specifically to stop them, not to save you, Connor, to control you. Because tomorrow morning my corporate litigators are going to lock the doors of your office. I am going to liquidate every single asset you possess. And when I am done picking the meat off your corporate bones, I am going to personally hand the evidence of your embezzlement straight to the federal prosecutor. You are going to prison. Chloe let out a breathless, horrifying sound. The heavy silver fork slipped from her fingers and clattered loudly against her china plate. She grabbed Connor's arm, shaking him violently. "Do something!" she screamed, her voice bordering on hysterical. "Connor, call your lawyers. Tell her she cannot do this to us. We are supposed to go to Aspen next week. My friends will ruin me." Connor just sat there completely broken. He knew there was no legal team on earth that could save him from a perfectly executed hostile debt takeover, especially when the acquiring party possessed unquestionable proof of his financial felonies. The white privilege he had wielded like a weapon his entire life, his arrogant assumption that he could simply outsmart and steal from an elderly black man without consequence, was absolutely useless against a flawless paper trail and unlimited capital. Aunt Shirley stood up next, her hands trembling as she looked at Yvonne with profound horror. "Is it true?" Yvonne Shirley demanded, her voice shaking. "Were you trying to steal Silas's money to pay off Connor's debts? Is that why you have been circulating those messages telling us Silas has advanced dementia? You lied to us to cover up a theft." "Shut up!" Shirley Yvonne roared, completely abandoning any pretense of suburban elegance. She slammed her hands down on the table, knocking over a crystal water goblet. The ice water spilled across the fine linen tablecloth, dripping onto the floor, but nobody moved to clean it up. Yvonne turned her venomous glare entirely on me. The narcissistic rage radiating from her was palpable. She could not accept defeat. Her ego simply would not allow her to acknowledge that the daughter she had designated as the family failure, the one she had financially abused and discarded, had entirely outplayed her. If she could not win through psychological manipulation, she was going to win through brute force. "You think you are so incredibly smart?" Yvonne hissed, her voice dropping into a terrifying guttural register. "You think because you hid your little company from us that you can walk into my house and dictate terms to me? I am the executor of this family. I am the one who makes the decisions." "You are nothing," I replied coldly, my voice unyielding. "You have no power here, Yvonne. Connor is finished, Chloe is broke, and your scheme to institutionalize Granddad is over. I hold the master deed to his house and the blind trust containing all his assets. You cannot touch him." Yvonne's eyes went wide with a manic, dangerous energy. She let out a sharp, unhinged laugh that echoed off the dining room walls, chilling everyone in the room. She reached into the pocket of her tailored trousers and pulled out her smartphone. "You really think a piece of paper is going to stop me?" Yvonne sneered, her fingers flying across the screen as she dialed a number. "You think you can outsmart me in my own game? I have the medical evaluations, Maya. I have a court-appointed notary who will stamp whatever I tell him to stamp for the right price. Silas is a sick, confused old man who needs immediate psychiatric intervention, and I am his devoted daughter acting in his best interest. Uncle Marcus took a step forward, raising his hands defensively. Yvonne put the phone down. Let us talk about this reasonably. You cannot force Silas out of his home. Watch me, Yvonne snapped, pressing the phone to her ear. She looked directly at me, her eyes burning with a destructive, chaotic fire. You think you have won? You have not won a single thing. I am Silas's daughter. I have the medical authority. We are moving on the old man's house tonight. I will send the orderlies right now. I will drag him out of that house by his hair if I have to. I watched the manic desperation contort my mother's face. She was a cornered animal willing to tear apart her own flesh and blood just to maintain her fragile delusion of control. Her phone was pressed hard against her ear as she waited for her corrupt notary to answer the call that would supposedly ruin my grandfather. She genuinely believed her rage was enough to bend reality to her will. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her chaotic energy. I simply raised my right hand and snapped my fingers. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot through the sudden silence of the dining room. Heavy synchronized footsteps immediately sounded from the front foyer. The heavy mahogany doors swung open and Keisha, my personal head of security, stepped into the room. Keisha was a former federal agent, a tall, imposing woman who radiated absolute lethal authority in her tailored black suit. Flanking her were two broad-shouldered security contractors moving with silent military precision. They stepped into the formal dining room, completely changing the atmospheric pressure of the space. The extended family collectively gasped. Uncle Marcus dropped his linen napkin onto his plate. Aunt Shirley clutched her chest, her eyes darting frantically from the armed men to me. They had spent the last 2 hours treating me like a pathetic charity case. Now I was sitting at the table flanked by a private security detail that cost more than their combined annual salaries. Keisha walked directly behind my chair and folded her hands behind her back. The two contractors moved to secure the front and rear exits of the dining room, standing at parade rest. "Put the phone down, Yvonne," I commanded, my voice slicing through the tension. "He is not going to answer. My legal team visited your notary at his private office 3 hours ago. We handed him a draft of the federal fraud and elder abuse charges we intend to file if he ever stamps another document with your name on it. He surrendered his seal to my attorneys. You have no notary and you have no power." Yvonne slowly lowered the phone. The device slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor. She stared at Keisha, then at me, her mind violently rejecting the reality unfolding in front of her. She gripped the back of Connor's chair, trying to physically steady herself. Connor remained entirely catatonic, his eyes glued to the corporate dossier that detailed his complete financial ruin. "You sit at the head of this table hosting Sunday dinner, pretending to be the pinnacle of generational wealth," I said, gesturing to the opulent spread of crystal goblets and fine china. "You look down your nose at everyone in this room, demanding their respect and obedience. But I know exactly how you funded this massive, pathetic illusion." Yvonne swallowed hard, her throat working visibly. "Maya, stop!" she warned, her voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "Do not do this." I ignored her, shifting my gaze to my sister. Chloe was hyperventilating, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the edge of the table. She looked terrified, realizing that the impenetrable shield of her mother's authority had just been shattered. "2 years ago, you threw Chloe a $250,000 destination wedding in Lake Como," I announced, ensuring my voice carried to every aunt, uncle, and cousin at the table. "You flew her friends on private charters, you rented a historic villa, you paid for custom floral arches and a champagne tower that cost more than a luxury car. The family thought you paid for it in cash because business was just so incredibly good." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. "But that was a lie. You took out 3 separate predatory loans against this very house just to pay for that wedding. You mortgaged your own future and leveraged your equity to the absolute breaking point just to buy Connor's wealthy family into liking you." Aunt Shirley let out a sharp, audible gasp. She looked at Yvonne with profound disgust. "You took out loans for a wedding?" Shirley asked, her voice trembling with outrage. "You told us you paid for that out of your investment returns, Yvonne. You sat in my kitchen and bragged about your portfolio. Yvonne could not look her sister in the eye. She kept her gaze fixed on the tablecloth, her chest heaving as her entire social standing evaporated into thin air. And the best part, I continued keeping my eyes locked on Yvonne. When I asked for the details of the flight so I could watch my only sister get married, you looked me dead in the eye and told me I was not invited. You told me that my cheap clothes and my community college posture did not fit the aesthetic of the wedding photos. You said I would embarrass you in front of Connor's high society friends. Chloe burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. Connor did not move to comfort her. He was too busy suffocating under the weight of his own destroyed ego. You sacrificed your financial stability to impress a man who is actively going to federal prison for embezzlement, I stated, letting the cold, hard truth settle over the room. You bet your entire life on the wrong horse, Yvonne, and you lost. My mother's head snapped up. Her eyes were bloodshot, her makeup starting to run from the sheer physical exertion of her panic. She bared her teeth, grasping blindly for any remaining shred of control. I am still the executor, she snarled, her voice shrill and desperate. I am still Silas's daughter. I will drag you through probate court. I will have a judge evaluate his mental state. You cannot keep me out of my father's house. I will send the police there tonight to conduct a wellness check and they will pull him out. I calmly reached back into my designer tote bag. I felt the smooth, heavy cardstock of 2 separate legal documents bound in dark blue legal covers. I pulled them out and placed them on the table. I slid the first document across the polished wood. It stopped right next to the spilled ice water from Yvonne's overturned goblet. You cannot evict Granddad Mom, I said, my voice dropping into a register of absolute finality. You cannot send orderlies to his door, and you cannot send the police. I bought his house 3 years ago, the very second I realized you were targeting his pension. I paid him above market value in cash, transferring the funds into the blind trust, so he could live out his days in total peace. The deed is fully in my name. He is my permanent, legally protected tenant, and his property is completely surrounded by my private security team right now. If you step 1 foot on that lawn, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing. Yvonne stared at the property deed. Her hands shook violently as she read my name printed in bold black ink at the top of the page. The last weapon she had against Silas, the threat of taking his home, had just been neutralized. But I did not stop there, I said, sliding the second blue-bound document across the table. It came to rest directly over the forged medical waiver she had tried to force me to sign minutes ago. Yvonne looked down at the second document. She did not touch it. She looked like she was staring at a venomous snake. When my forensic accountants were mapping out Connor's spectacular financial collapse, I had them look into your predatory loans, I explained, leaning back in my chair and crossing my legs. Your lenders are loan sharks, Yvonne. They thrive on desperate people trying to maintain fake wealth. When I approached them through a shell company and offered to buy your toxic defaulted mortgages for a lump sum cash payment, they were absolutely thrilled to sell. Yvonne's knees finally buckled. She swayed heavily, dropping into the chair beside Connor. The breath left her body in a long, defeated wheeze. I bought the mortgage to this pristine suburban colonial, I announced, the words echoing loudly against the high ceilings. I own the debt. I own the paper. I am your landlord now. The silence that followed was entirely absolute. Even Chloe stopped crying, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. Uncle Marcus and Aunt Shirley sat perfectly still, watching the complete and total dismantling of the woman who had terrorized and belittled them for decades. I reached into my bag one final time and pulled out a single crisp white sheet of paper. It was not bound in a blue cover. It was a standard state-issued legal form. I stood up from my chair and walked slowly around the dining table. My heels clicked against the hardwood, mirroring the exact aggressive rhythm my mother had used when she walked in to ambush my grandfather. I stopped right next to her chair. She refused to look up at me. I dropped the crisp white paper directly onto her dinner plate, right on top of her untouched food. Since you are 3 months behind on those predatory loan payments, you are in total breach of contract, I informed her, my voice void of any sympathy or hesitation. I do not tolerate delinquent tenants, Yvonne. Here is your official, legally binding 7-day notice to vacate my property. I looked down at the woman who had spent 35 years calling me a failure. You have exactly 1 week to pack your bags and figure out where you are going. Failures do not belong in my houses. The heavy silence in the lobby was absolute. The background hum of the morning commute seemed to completely vanish, leaving only the devastating echo of Richard Sterling's words. Connor's eyes widened to an impossible degree. His mouth hung open, but the arrogant, condescending words he had relied on his entire life had completely abandoned him. He looked at Richard, then slowly, agonizingly turned his gaze back to me. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The black woman he had spent years mocking at Sunday dinners, the sister-in-law he had confidently belittled just 24 hours ago, was not just a successful entrepreneur. She was his landlord. She was his debt holder. She was the architect of his total annihilation. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I simply adjusted my designer tote bag on my shoulder and stepped through the open glass turnstile, leaving Connor standing frozen in the lobby under the watchful, judgmental eyes of his own building security. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor was silent and smooth. When the steel doors opened, I stepped out into the plush, aggressively modern reception area of Connor's venture capital firm. The atmosphere up here was pure chaos. Administrative assistants were frantic, phones were ringing off the hook, and junior executives were huddled in terrified clusters. They already knew the ship was sinking. I bypassed the reception desk and walked straight down the main corridor toward the executive boardroom. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, I could see Andre sitting at the head of the massive mahogany conference table. He was flanked by 3 of my senior corporate litigators. Across from them sat Connor's remaining board members, a collection of older wealthy investors who looked physically ill. I pushed the glass door open and stepped into the room. The conversations immediately died. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said, my voice crisp and authoritative. I took the empty leather chair positioned directly opposite Andre. "Let us not waste time. As of yesterday morning, my holding company acquired the entirety of this firm's defaulted debt. Your CEO, Connor Blackwood, has been systematically embezzling your capital to fund his personal lifestyle. The documentation is in the folders before you." The board members scrambled to open the thick dossiers Andre had prepared. I watched their faces contort in horror as they read the hard, irrefutable numbers. "Connor will be arriving shortly," I continued, leaning forward and resting my hands on the table. "When he does, you will unanimously vote to terminate him with cause. You will sign over all remaining equity to my subsidiary, and you will cooperate fully with the federal investigation I am initiating this afternoon. If you attempt to protect him, my attorneys will ensure that every single one of you is named as a co-conspirator in his fraud." Before anyone could object, the boardroom door violently swung open. Connor stumbled into the room. He was breathless, his face a terrifying shade of gray. He looked at the board members, his eyes begging for salvation, but they refused to meet his gaze. They were already looking at him like a dead man. "Maya, please." Connor gasped, his voice a pathetic, broken wheeze. He practically collapsed into the nearest chair, gripping the armrest to keep his hands from shaking. "Please, you cannot do this. If you go to the feds, I am going to prison. Chloe will lose everything. You are destroying your own family." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. "I am not destroying my family, Connor. I am excising a tumor." I turned to Andre, giving him a brief nod. Andre smoothly slid a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany table toward Connor. It was a formal termination agreement, stripping him of his title, his access, and his severance. "Sign it," Andre instructed, his voice radiating pure legal menace. "Or we freeze your personal domestic accounts before lunch." Connor stared at the paper, tears of pure panic finally spilling over his eyelashes. He picked up the pen with a violently trembling hand and signed his professional life away. The hostile takeover was entirely complete by 10:30. I left Andre and the legal team to manage the federal reporting and the asset liquidation. I had one more piece of business to attend to. When I stepped out of the high-rise and into the bright Atlanta sun, my phone began to vibrate violently in the pocket of my blazer. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was Yvonne. She had been calling me incessantly for the last hour. I answered the call, pressing the phone to my ear as my driver opened the door to the town car. "Maya," Yvonne screamed, her voice completely unhinged. The forced suburban elegance was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, shrieking panic of a woman whose house of cards was burning down around her. Chloe just called me sobbing. She said you locked Connor out of his own office. She said you bought his debt. What have you done? I settled into the plush leather seat of the car, watching the city pass by the tinted windows. I secured my investment, Yvonne. You malicious, jealous little brat! Yvonne roared, the phone crackling with the force of her rage. You planned this. You hid your money and planned to destroy your sister's life because you could never stand seeing her happy. You think you are so brilliant. You think you have won. I held the phone away from my ear as she took a sharp, jagged breath. I am Silas's daughter, she hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying absolute malice. I am the executor. I just got off the phone with my notary. He is drafting the emergency medical mandate right now. We are moving on the old man's house tonight. I do not care what deeds you claim to have. I will send the police. I will drag him out by his hair if I have to, and I will force the courts to liquidate his estate to cover Connor's debts. You cannot stop me. I listened to her rant, my expression completely flat. My mother was willing to subject her own father to the trauma of a forced police eviction, just to salvage the financial wreckage of her racist, embezzling son-in-law. There was no limit to her depravity. Are you finished, Yvonne? I asked calmly. I am just getting started, she screamed. Good, I replied. Then you should probably look out your front window. There was a sudden confused silence on the other end of the line. What are you talking about? I snapped my fingers, signaling my driver to pull out into the traffic. You took out 3 predatory loans against your own house to pay for Chloe's $250,000 wedding in Italy, I stated, reciting the exact facts my forensic accountants had uncovered. You leveraged your entire equity to the absolute breaking point. You are 3 months behind on those payments. Yvonne stopped breathing. The silence on the phone was absolute. While you were telling me I wasn't invited to that wedding because I didn't fit the aesthetic, I was buying out your predatory lender. I continued, my voice cold and surgical. I own the mortgage to your pristine suburban colonial. I am your landlord now. And since you are in breach of contract, I dispatched my private security team to deliver a message. Through the phone, I heard the faint, heavy sound of knocking echoing in the background. It was the distinct, authoritative pounding of a formal delivery. You can't evict Granddad Mom, I said, delivering the final fatal blow. Because I bought his house 3 years ago to protect him from you. But you are currently being served with a 7-day notice to vacate my property. Start packing. I turned on my heel and walked out of the formal dining room, leaving Yvonne staring at the eviction notice resting on her untouched plate. I did not look back. The cool night air hit my face as I exited the house, feeling an immense weight lift from my shoulders. The toxic foundation my mother had built her entire life upon was finally crumbling to dust. Sunday dinner was officially over. The real execution was scheduled for Monday morning. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, I stepped into the gleaming glass and steel lobby of Connor's venture capital firm. The high-rise architecture was designed to intimidate, featuring towering marble pillars and an army of receptionists. But I walked through the double doors with absolute ownership. Connor was already there. He was pacing frantically near the security turnstiles, a slick sheen of sweat coating his forehead. He looked as though he had not slept a single minute. When he saw me striding across the lobby, his face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. He lunged forward, signaling the 2 armed security guards and pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. "She is a trespasser!" Connor yelled, his voice echoing loudly off the polished marble floors and drawing the attention of dozens of commuting employees. "Remove her immediately. You think a little money changes who you are, Maya? You are still the same pathetic loser your mother warned me about. Get her out of my building." I did not argue with the guards. I did not even break my stride. I calmly reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a solid platinum master keycard. Just as the security guard stepped forward, the primary building owner, a tall, distinguished real estate magnate who had been fully briefed on my weekend acquisitions, stepped out of the private executive elevator. He walked past, The guards shook my hand warmly and turned a cold, unyielding stare onto Connor. "Mr. Connor," the owner said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You do realize her subsidiary company owns this entire high-rise, right? She is not a trespasser. She is the landlord." Connor completely froze. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. The security guards immediately stepped back, lowering their hands and averting their eyes. I walked right past him, swiping my platinum card against the scanner and stepping into the executive elevator. The doors slid shut on his horrified expression. I bypassed his corner office completely and walked straight into the main boardroom. The massive glass-walled room was already full. The entire board of directors sat around the long mahogany table, looking incredibly tense and confused by the emergency meeting summons. My attorney Andre sat at the far end, organizing a towering stack of thick red forensic accounting folders. I took the seat at the head of the table. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said, placing my briefcase on the polished wood. "I am Maya Washington, founder and CEO of Washington Tech Solutions. As of Friday afternoon, my holding company successfully executed a hostile takeover of this firm by acquiring your $4 million defaulted bridge loan. I legally own this company and everything in it." Before the board could even register the shock of my statement, the heavy glass doors burst open. Connor stumbled into the boardroom, panting heavily. His designer tie loosened and his hair a frantic mess. He grabbed the back of a leather chair, looking desperately at the board members. "Do not listen to her," Connor gasped, his voice cracking. "She is unstable. She is my sister-in-law. This is just a petty family dispute. I have the capital to fix this." I slid the first red folder across the table directly to the board chairman. "I present the forensic accounting files my legal team prepared over the weekend," I announced, ignoring Connor entirely. "You will find that your CEO has not just defaulted on a massive corporate loan. He has been aggressively embezzling funds from your primary investors for the past 24 months. The room erupted in shocked, furious murmurs as the directors tore open their files. I directed their attention to page 4. I did not just expose his default, I proved exactly where every single stolen dollar went. I highlighted the exact shell companies Connor had created to siphon capital off the books. I traced the stolen funds directly to their incredibly embarrassing end destinations. $500,000 was funneled into a private offshore account to fund a destination wedding in Italy. I stated, my voice razor sharp, cutting through the rising panic in the room. $200,000 was illegally transferred to pay for Chloe Blackwood's designer wardrobe, luxury vehicles, diamond tennis bracelets, and frequent ski trips to Aspen. Connor let out a strangled, pathetic cry. "Maya, stop. You cannot do this." I did not stop. Furthermore, I continued, flipping to the next heavily annotated page. I have documented wire transfers, proving that investor capital was explicitly used to pay for Yvonne Washington's exclusive country club memberships and private charity galas. Your CEO has been stealing millions of dollars from your most trusted clients to artificially inflate the social status of my mother and my sister. He has compromised this entire firm to fund a pathetic suburban illusion. The board chairman slammed his folder shut, his face pale with absolute fury. "Connor, is this true?" Connor sank into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. "It was a temporary float," he mumbled weakly. "I was going to pay it back after the next funding round." "That is a confession," I noted, turning back to the board. "Gentlemen, as the majority stakeholder holding your defaulted debt, I am enacting an immediate executive restructuring. I am terminating Connor Blackwood as CEO, effective immediately." Connor shot up his chair, tipping over backward and crashing onto the floor. "You cannot do this to me. I built this firm. You are ruining my life." "You bankrupted this firm," I corrected coldly, my gaze fixed on him. "You are terminated with cause. You forfeit all severance, all equity, and all stock options. My attorneys have already frozen your domestic accounts. The federal authorities have been notified of your massive embezzlement scheme, and the Securities and Exchange Commission will be reviewing these exact files before lunch." I signaled to the two large security guards who had followed us up from the lobby. Escort Mr. Blackwood out of my building." The guard stepped forward, grabbing Connor firmly by the arms. The man who had mocked my clothing and my career just a day ago thrashed against them, his pristine corporate image shattering into a million irreparable pieces. He screamed my name. He hurled vicious insults and begged for mercy in the exact same breath. I sat perfectly still, watching his own security team drag him out of the glass boardroom. His expensive leather shoes scuffed against the carpet as they pulled him down the hallway. The heavy doors swung shut, cutting off his pathetic cries. The corporate takedown was flawlessly complete. The boardroom was dead silent. The remaining directors stared at me with a mixture of profound terror and deep respect. I turned back to the table, ready to outline the transition plan and secure the firm's remaining assets. But before I could speak, my cell phone began to ring sharply against the mahogany table. The sudden noise made several board members jump. I glanced down at the screen, expecting a call from my banking team. Instead, the caller ID displayed the name of Mr. Henderson, my grandfather Silas's loyal next-door neighbor. A cold spike of adrenaline hit my chest. I picked up the phone. "Hello?" Maya, the elderly man, shouted, his voice shaking with absolute frantic panic. "Maya, you need to get over here right now. Your mother just showed up at Silas's house with a private ambulance and 2 men with a straitjacket." The crisp, Monday morning air carried the distinct electric charge of absolute destruction. I stepped out of my town car onto the pristine pavement of the downtown Atlanta financial district. I was wearing a sharply tailored bone-white Tom Ford suit, my hair pulled back into a severe, flawless chignon. I looked exactly like what I was. I was an apex predator stepping directly into my newly acquired territory. My lead attorney, Andre, walked right beside me, carrying a heavy leather briefcase containing the forensic accounting files that would formally end Connor Blackwood's entire existence. Flanking us were 2 armed private security contractors moving with silent military precision. We approached the towering glass and steel high-rise that housed Connor's venture capital firm. The architecture was deliberately designed to intimidate. It was a massive monument to corporate greed, featuring a cavernous lobby lined with imported Italian marble and staffed by an army of overly aggressive security guards. For the last 5 years, Connor had walked through these very doors believing he was an untouchable titan of industry. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of his wealth, using it to demean me, to manipulate my family, and to fund a lavish lifestyle stolen directly from the pockets of his unsuspecting investors. But his reign of terror had officially expired on Friday. Today was the execution. We walked through the revolving glass doors, and the sheer panic radiating through the massive lobby was palpable. Connor was standing near the primary bank of elevators, pacing frantically like a cornered animal. He looked absolutely terrible. His designer suit was severely wrinkled, his tie was pulled completely loose, and a slick sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead. He had clearly spent the entire weekend completely spiraling after I had dropped the bombshell at Sunday dinner. He knew my holding company had purchased his defaulted $4 million bridge loan. He knew I had initiated the hostile takeover, and he knew that an emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock this morning to formally strip him of his title and turn his fraudulent financial records over to the federal authorities. But Connor was a desperate, unyielding narcissist. He could not simply accept defeat gracefully. His ego required him to fight to his absolute dying breath. He had gathered 6 burly building security guards, forming a solid human barricade in front of the elevator banks. He was frantically barking orders at them, trying to construct a physical wall between me and his boardroom. When Connor saw me striding across the polished marble floor, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged forward, extending a shaking finger directly at my chest. "There she is," Connor bellowed, his voice echoing loudly against the high ceilings and causing dozens of commuting professionals to stop dead in their tracks. "Do not let her pass the turnstiles. She is not authorized to be in this building." I did not break my stride. I continued walking with calm, measured steps, my security detail parting the sea of shocked onlookers. Andre remained perfectly composed at my side, a lethal legal weapon ready to be deployed. "She is a trespasser," Connor yelled aggressively, waving his hands at the head security guard. I am the CEO of the firm on the 42nd floor, and I am explicitly telling you that this woman is a hostile threat. Remove her immediately. Call the police if you have to. Just get her out of my building right now. The head security guard, a broad-shouldered man with a severe expression, stepped forward and raised a heavy hand, signaling for me to stop. "Ma'am," the guard said, his tone gruff and unyielding. "Mr. Blackwood has flagged you as an unauthorized visitor. I need you to turn around and exit the premises immediately, or we will have to forcibly remove you." I stopped a few feet away from the barricade of guards. I looked directly at Connor. He had stepped out from behind the security team, puffing out his chest and adopting the arrogant, condescending posture he had used against me for years. He was leaning entirely on his white privilege, fully expecting that a group of uniformed men would blindly obey his commands and throw a black woman out onto the street without asking a single question. He felt incredibly powerful, hiding behind other men. "You really thought you could just waltz in here and take my company?" Connor sneered, taking a step closer to me. His breath smelled stale, and his eyes were bloodshot with panic. "You think because you hid your money and bought up my debt that you are suddenly my equal? You are nothing, Maya. You are a complete fraud." I stared at him, my face a mask of absolute stone. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of emotion. "I am executing a legally binding corporate takeover, Connor. The board of directors is waiting upstairs to review the evidence of your massive embezzlement scheme. You can either step aside and face your fate like a man, or you can embarrass yourself further in front of half the financial district." Connor let out a harsh, manic laugh. He leaned in so close I could see the frantic desperation burning in his pupils. "You think a little money changes who you are? Maya." He spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You are still the same pathetic loser your mother warned me about. You are the family scapegoat. You are the joke we laugh about at Sunday dinner. You do not belong in a place like this. You never will. Now get the hell out of my lobby before I have you thrown out in handcuffs." The head security guard stepped aggressively into my personal space, his hand resting heavily on his utility belt. "Lady, I will not ask you again," the guard growled. "Turn around and walk out those doors, or things are going to get physical." Andre shifted his weight, preparing to verbally decimate the guard with a barrage of legal threats, but I suddenly held up my hand, stopping him. I did not need my attorney to fight this battle. I did not need to scream or shout or validate Connor's pathetic, desperate attempt to paint me as an unstable, aggressive trespasser. Connor crossed his arms over his chest, a smug, satisfied smile finally breaking through the terror on his face. He actually believed he had won. He genuinely thought that by blocking me from the elevators, he could somehow stop the multi-million-dollar corporate avalanche that was currently crushing his life. He thought he could outsmart a hostile takeover by simply throwing a temper tantrum in the lobby. "You always were out of your depth, Maya," Connor mocked, shaking his head. "Go back to your little studio apartment. I will deal with your bogus debt claims later. I have a company to run." The sheer delusion of his statement was staggering. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the dozens of spectators in the lobby to hang on his every word. I wanted everyone in this building to witness the absolute peak of his arrogance before I completely destroyed it. I don't argue with the guards. I did not raise my voice or cause a scene. I simply maintained eye contact with Connor as I slowly reached into the interior pocket of my bone-white blazer. The guards tensed, ready for a physical altercation, but I calmly pulled out a single sleek piece of plastic. It was not a standard visitor badge. It was a heavy, solid platinum master keycard laser engraved with a highly restricted corporate insignia. Before the head security guard could even register what I was holding, a soft, melodic chime echoed through the tense lobby. The private dedicated executive elevator, the one strictly reserved for the building's absolute upper echelon of management, slid open. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped out into the lobby. It was Richard Sterling, the legendary real estate magnate and primary owner of the high-rise. The security guards instantly stiffened, dropping their aggressive postures and standing at sharp attention. Connor's smug smile faltered slightly, but he quickly puffed his chest back out, assuming Sterling was coming over to help him deal with the disturbance. Richard Sterling completely ignored Connor. He walked straight through the barricade of security guards, extending his hand toward me with a wide, respectful smile. "Maya, it is an absolute pleasure to finally meet you in person," Sterling said, his voice booming across the quiet lobby. "I was just reviewing the final transfer documents. Your team moves incredibly fast. We are absolutely thrilled to have Washington Tech Solutions taking over the portfolio." I shook his hand firmly, matching his professional warmth. "Thank you, Richard. The acquisition was a top priority for us. I'm just heading upstairs to clear out some dead weight before the board meeting." Sterling nodded, turning his gaze toward the barricade of confused security guards and finally landing on Connor. Connor was staring at the two of us, his jaw hanging slack, his brain short-circuiting as he tried to comprehend why the most powerful man in the building was treating me like royalty. "Mr. Connor," Sterling said, his voice suddenly dropping its warmth and adopting a tone of cold, sharp incredulity. "Why are you instructing my security team to harass this woman?" "She is a trespasser," Connor stammered, pointing a weak, shaking finger at me. "She does not belong here, Richard. She is trying to unlawfully enter my offices. You have to remove her immediately." Sterling let out a short, completely baffled laugh. He looked at Connor with the kind of profound pity usually reserved for absolute fools. "Mr. Connor, you do realize her subsidiary company owns this entire high-rise, right?" The crisp audio cracked through the high-fidelity Bluetooth speakers mounted under the eaves of Silas's wrap-around porch. For a fraction of a second, the sheer volume startled the gathered neighbors, causing a few to jump back. Then the voices began to play, and the entire manicured suburban street went completely dead silent. It was Connor first. His recorded voice was frantic, unpolished, and dripping with sheer greed. "We need that 5 million, Yvonne. You do not understand. If Maya looks at the venture capital ledger before we cover the spread, I am going to federal prison. You promised me Silas's estate was liquid." Then came Yvonne's voice. Hearing her own voice echoing across the lawn made my mother physically recoil as if she had been struck by lightning. "I have the notary in my pocket, Connor. Do not panic. I am having the emergency medical mandate drafted right now. We declare the old man mentally incompetent, we force him into that state-run facility, and as his power of attorney, I can liquidate his pension and the house by Friday. He will not even know what happened until he is locked in a psychiatric ward." And finally, Chloe, my sweet, innocent sister, chiming in with the final nail in the coffin. "Just make sure the facility is cheap, Mom. I am not losing my lifestyle because Granddad needs a nice room. Put him wherever takes Medicaid so we can keep the cash." The collective gasp from the neighbors was loud and undeniable. Mrs. Higgins, who had just been comforting Yvonne and offering her a tissue, dropped her hand as if she had been burned by acid. Mr. Henderson, Silas's loyal friend, gripped his wooden walking cane tightly, his eyes wide with absolute disgust. Yvonne stood frozen on the pristine grass. The theatrical tears that had been streaming down her face just moments ago completely vanished, leaving only a mask of pure, unfiltered terror. Her jaw dropped. She looked at the speakers, then at the crowd of horrified neighbors, and finally her eyes locked onto me. I stood perfectly still on the steps of the porch, my phone in my hand, projecting her ultimate ruin for the entire world to hear. The two paramedics who had been gently but firmly trying to coax a trembling Silas toward the waiting ambulance stopped dead in their tracks. The lead paramedic, a burly man with years of experience reading terrible situations, slowly lowered his hands. He looked at the medical mandate clipboard Yvonne had shoved into his hands just 10 minutes prior. He looked at the forged notary stamp. Then he looked at Yvonne. The professional empathy in his eyes was instantly replaced by cold, hard suspicion. "Turn that off!" Yvonne shrieked, her voice breaking into a hysterical register. She lunged toward the porch, her manicured hands grasping blindly at the air. "It is a fake. She is a liar. That is not me. It is one of those AI deepfakes. Maya is mentally unstable. I told you she is trying to destroy this family." She turned frantically back to the paramedics, pointing a shaking finger at Silas. "Do your jobs. I have the legal paperwork. I am his daughter and his power of attorney. He is a danger to himself. Put him in the ambulance right now." I physically stepped directly between the paramedics and my grandfather. Silas reached out and gripped the back of my blazer, his hands trembling, but his breathing finally starting to steady. He knew he was safe. "You do not have a power of attorney, Yvonne," I stated, my voice carrying easily across the silent lawn. "You have a fraudulent document stamped by a corrupt notary who surrendered his seal to my legal team yesterday afternoon. The man you conspired with is currently facing federal fraud charges. That piece of paper in your hand is nothing but a signed confession to a felony." The lead paramedic immediately took 3 large steps backward, distancing himself entirely from Yvonne. He realized instantly that his medical license and his freedom were on the line if he transported a kidnapped man. He unclipped the radio from his shoulder harness. "Dispatch, we have a 1033 on scene. Suspected fraudulent medical mandate and elder abuse in progress. We need law enforcement here immediately. Do not transport the patient. I repeat, do not transport." Hearing the paramedic call for the police broke the last remaining thread of Yvonne's sanity. She completely unraveled. She lunged at me, screaming wildly, her face contorted with a rage I had never seen before. "Arrest her!" Yvonne shrieked, waving the forged documents in the air. "She is interfering with a medical emergency. She is trespassing. This is my father. This is my house. I am in charge here." "You are in charge of nothing," I replied, staring down at her from the porch steps. "You mortgaged your own home to pay for a wedding. You conspired with an embezzler, and you tried to lock your own father in a state-run asylum just to steal his life savings. You are not a victim, Yvonne. You are a predator who finally stepped into a trap you could not talk your way out of." The heavy wail of approaching sirens cut through the morning air. 2 police cruisers turned sharply onto the quiet suburban street, their lights flashing brightly against the manicured lawns. They pulled up directly behind the private ambulance, blocking it in completely. 4 officers stepped out of the vehicles, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts as they assessed the chaotic scene. Yvonne immediately sprinted toward them, slipping back into her practiced role of the distressed suburban mother. "Officers, thank God you are here," she cried, pointing frantically at me. "You need to arrest my daughter. She is completely out of control. She is interfering with a medical transport. I have the legal power of attorney to commit my father, and she is stopping them." The lead officer, a tall, imposing man with graying hair, held up his hand to stop her frantic approach. He looked past her to the paramedics. "What is the situation here?" The lead paramedic walked over, handing the officer the clipboard with Yvonne's documents. "We were called for a routine psychiatric transport, officer. But the granddaughter arrived and played an audio recording indicating this woman and her son-in-law forged these documents to liquidate the patient's assets. We suspect attempted elder abuse." Yvonne gasped, clutching her chest. "That is a lie. The audio is fake. She hates me." I calmly walked down the porch steps, leaving Silas safely near the front door. I approached the lead officer and handed him a pristine blue-bound folder from my tote bag. "Officer, my name is Maya Washington," I said respectfully. "Inside that folder you will find the actual legal deed to this property, proving I am the sole owner. You will also find a certified letter from Silas's primary care physician, dated yesterday, confirming he is in perfect mental and physical health. Finally, I have the raw audio file of this woman plotting to forge a medical mandate to steal $5 million. The officer took the folder. He reviewed the pristine deed. He read the doctor's note. Then he looked at the crude, smudged notary stamp on the document Yvonne had provided. The discrepancy was glaringly obvious. He did not even need to hear the audio again to know exactly what he was looking at. He closed the blue folder and handed it back to me with a brief acknowledging nod. He turned his attention slowly and entirely to Yvonne. Yvonne's eyes darted frantically between the officer, my calm face, and the neighbors who were watching her total destruction with wide eyes. She took a step backward, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her designer purse onto the grass. "Officer, please," she whispered, her voice completely devoid of its usual arrogant power. "You have to understand, I was just trying to protect my family. Connor said we needed the money." The lead officer approaches, listening to the end of the recording. He looks at the forged document in Yvonne's hand. "Ma'am," the officer says coldly, unhooking his handcuffs. Step away from the elderly gentleman. You are under arrest for elder abuse, forgery, and attempted fraud. 2 weeks had passed since the flashing red and blue lights of the local police cruisers illuminated the pristine, manicured lawns of my grandfather's neighborhood. 2 weeks since the cold, undeniable reality of a pair of steel handcuffs snapped shut around my mother's wrists, while her neighbors watched in absolute horrified silence. Yet if you were to walk into the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel tonight, you would absolutely never know that Yvonne Washington was currently out on a $500,000 bail bond, facing a massive federal indictment for forgery and elder abuse. The Women of Excellence in the Community Charity Gala was in full swing, and the sheer scale of the delusion in the room was truly staggering. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over tables draped in heavy silk and adorned with towering, extravagant arrangements of white orchids. A string quartet played softly in the corner, while waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided effortlessly through the room, carrying silver trays of expensive champagne and caviar. It was a masterpiece of social illusion, perfectly designed to mask the rot underneath. Yvonne stood near the center of the room, wearing a custom emerald green gown that she had undoubtedly charged to a maxed-out high-interest credit card. She was completely surrounded by the city's wealthiest socialites, holding court as if she were untouchable royalty. I watched her from a discreet shadowed alcove on the mezzanine level, observing the frantic, desperate energy vibrating just beneath her practiced smile. Her performance was truly Oscar-worthy. She dabbed at her perfectly powdered eyes with a lace handkerchief, shaking her head with practiced maternal sorrow as she spun her web of desperate lies to the women gathered around her. "It is just a minor family misunderstanding," Yvonne sighed loudly, ensuring her voice carried to the neighboring tables. "You all know how difficult my youngest daughter Maya has always been. She has always been so deeply troubled, so incredibly jealous of her sister Chloe and the success of our family. She completely fabricated this whole legal nightmare out of pure spite. She manipulated the police with fake audio recordings and caused a terrible scene." The wealthy women surrounding her nodded in polite, sympathetic agreement, sipping their champagne. They loved the scandalous gossip, but they loved maintaining the comfortable status quo even more. "But the authorities are sorting it out as we speak," Yvonne continued, projecting an air of absolute confidence. "We expect a full dismissal of all these ridiculous charges by the end of the month. My legal team is handling the clerical errors. Families fight, and unfortunately, my troubled daughter chose to air our private grievances in a very public, embarrassing manner. But I refuse to let her instability ruin this beautiful evening of charity. Community excellence must always march forward." Yvonne was banking entirely on their inherent politeness to shield her from the brutal reality of her pending federal fraud trial. She truly believed that if she just wore the right designer dress and smiled brightly enough, the justice system would simply evaporate into thin air. Across the sprawling ballroom, Chloe was putting on an equally pathetic performance. She stood near a massive sculpted ice centerpiece, wearing a strained smile that looked physically painful to maintain. Connor was nowhere to be seen. He was likely hiding in a dark hotel bar somewhere, terrified to show his face in public while facing a massive federal indictment for corporate embezzlement and the total liquidation of his venture capital firm. But Chloe played the part of the devoted, wildly successful wife. She laughed too loudly at jokes and aggressively steered conversations away from anything related to venture capital, real estate, or the sudden absence of her husband. She was a woman standing on the deck of a sinking ship, vigorously polishing the brass and pretending the freezing water was not already rushing over her expensive designer heels. The truth was that Yvonne and Chloe were completely and utterly destitute. The corporate takeover of Connor's firm had severed their only source of stolen income. My legal maneuverings had frozen all of their remaining assets, including the accounts they had used to fund their lavish lifestyle. They could not even afford the retainer for a decent criminal defense attorney. Their entire future, their freedom, and their social standing rested entirely on a single desperate gamble. For the past 6 months, this specific charity gala had been heavily bankrolled by an anonymous billionaire sponsor. This mystery benefactor had covered the exorbitant venue costs, the high-end catering, the floral arrangements, and the massive marketing budget that made the event possible. Yvonne had convinced herself and Chloe that this sponsor was a wealthy admirer of her community work. She was absolutely certain that tonight she would finally meet this mysterious savior face to face. She had spent the last 2 weeks assuring her panicked legal team that she was about to secure a massive private donation from this benefactor that would cover their mounting legal fees and make her criminal charges disappear forever. From my vantage point on the mezzanine, I watched Yvonne pull Chloe aside near the silent auction tables. They thought they were out of earshot, but my position allowed me to hear their frantic, hushed tones as their practiced smiles slipped for just a fraction of a second. "Did the event coordinator say when the sponsor is arriving?" Yvonne whispered fiercely, gripping Chloe's arm so tightly her manicured nails dug into the fabric of Chloe's dress. "We need to secure a private meeting with them before the award presentation begins. My lawyers are demanding their full retainer by Monday morning. If we do not get a check tonight, we are completely finished, Chloe." "I asked the event staff twice," Chloe replied, her voice trembling with barely suppressed panic. "They said the sponsor is already in the building and waiting for the final presentation." "Mom, what if they say no? What if they read the news about the arrest? Connor's attorneys are abandoning him because we cannot pay them. We have absolutely nothing left. We are going to lose the house." Yvonne tightened her grip on her daughter's arm, her eyes flashing with a desperate, terrifying kind of denial. "Stop it," she hissed venomously. "Do not look panicked. Smile. We are the Washington family. We do not fail. This benefactor has poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into my foundation over the last few months. They clearly believe in my vision and my leadership. Once I explain that Maya is just a bitter, jealous liar trying to extort us, they will absolutely cover the legal fees to protect the foundation's image. We just have to maintain the narrative. Now fix your makeup, stop shaking, and go mingle with the mayor's wife." Chloe swallowed hard, plastering that fake fragile smile back onto her face and wading back into the crowd of oblivious, wealthy donors. Yvonne took a deep, calming breath, smoothed the front of her emerald gown, and signaled for a waiter to bring her another glass of champagne. The sheer audacity of her delusion was a marvel to witness. She was standing in a room paid for by someone else wearing clothes she could not afford, banking on a savior she had never met, to rescue her from crimes she had absolutely committed. The grand grandfather clock in the corner of the ballroom struck 9. It was time. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing, and a sudden hushed anticipation rippled through the massive crowd. The master of ceremonies, a prominent local television anchor dressed in a sharp tuxedo, stepped up to the crystal podium at the front of the room. He tapped the microphone, sending a low, reverberating hum across the elegant ballroom. The attendees immediately quieted down, turning their attention to the main stage. Yvonne moved swiftly to the very front of the crowd, positioning herself perfectly in the center aisle, ready to receive her adoration and her massive check. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies began, his rich baritone voice filling the room. "Thank you all for joining us tonight for the Women of Excellence in the Community Gala. Tonight we celebrate resilience. We celebrate profound truth. And most importantly, we celebrate the incredible power of giving back to those who truly deserve it." Yvonne beamed, looking around at her peers with a look of supreme, arrogant triumph. She clearly thought the entire speech was a direct tribute to her personal struggles. She even placed a modest hand over her heart, feigning absolute humility for the cameras stationed around the room. "But tonight is not just about the awards," the master of ceremonies continued, glancing down at a gold-embossed envelope resting on the podium. "Tonight is about acknowledging the specific relentless force that made this entire evening possible. For the past 6 months, this foundation has been kept alive by the unprecedented generosity of a single visionary individual. An individual who has chosen to remain completely anonymous until this very moment." A collective murmur of excitement swept through the crowd of socialites. Yvonne stood on her tiptoes, her eyes scanning the room hungrily, ready to lock eyes with the billionaire who was going to save her from federal prison. Chloe stood rigidly beside her, gripping a champagne flute so tightly her knuckles were completely white. And now, to present tonight's award, we welcome the anonymous benefactor who single-handedly funded this entire foundation. The master of ceremonies announced, his voice rising to a dramatic, echoing crescendo. Please direct your attention above. The main stage lights suddenly plunged into total darkness. The entire ballroom gasped in unison. A heartbeat later, a blinding white spotlight snapped on, slicing through the darkness and illuminating the very top of the grand marble staircase. The blinding white spotlight snapped on, slicing through the darkness and illuminating the very top of the grand marble staircase. I stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtains, stepping directly into the center of the brilliant beam. I was wearing a custom-tailored crimson silk gown that swept the floor, a piece that radiated absolute authority and untouchable wealth. Diamonds rested coolly against my collarbone, catching the light and throwing fractured prisms across the darkened walls. The collective gasp from the ballroom was instantaneous and deafening. Hundreds of the city's most elite socialites, politicians, and business moguls stared up at me in absolute shock. At the base of the staircase, Yvonne completely froze. The delicate crystal champagne flute slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the polished marble floor and shattered into 100 jagged pieces, the expensive vintage spilling across her designer shoes. She could not breathe. She could not speak. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it looked as though her soul had just left her body. Chloe stood beside her, her jaw hanging slack, completely paralyzed by the realization that the anonymous savior they had been desperately banking their entire future on was the very woman they had spent their entire lives trying to destroy. I walked down the marble steps with deliberate, measured grace. The crowd parted for me instinctively, opening a wide path straight to the stage. I did not look at my mother or my sister as I passed them. They were already ghosts to me. I stepped up to the crystal podium. The master of ceremonies, clearly briefed by my team beforehand, stepped respectfully to the side and handed me the microphone. I looked out over the sea of wealthy, expectant faces. The room was so silent you could hear the soft rustle of silk and the sharp, rapid breaths of my mother standing in the front row. "Good evening," I said, my voice calm, steady, and projecting effortlessly through the massive sound system. "My name is Maya Washington. I am the founder and CEO of Washington Tech Solutions, and I am the sole financial benefactor of the Women of Excellence in the Community Foundation." A ripple of excited, confused murmurs washed through the crowd. People began clapping politely, assuming this was a standard philanthropic introduction. I held up a single hand, and the applause instantly died. "I funded this gala tonight, and I funded this foundation for the past 6 months, because I believe deeply in the power of truth." I continued, my gaze locking directly onto Yvonne. "But truth is entirely absent in this room. You are all standing in a monument to fraud." I pressed a small remote hidden in my palm. Behind me, 3 massive digital projection screens dropped smoothly from the ceiling. The stage lights dimmed further, making the high-definition displays impossible to ignore. The screens flared to life, displaying pristine, highly detailed forensic accounting audits, bank statements, and cleared checks. "For the past 5 years, Yvonne Washington has stood before you asking for your trust and your capital," I announced, my voice echoing like thunder. She claimed to be a champion of community excellence, but as the primary financial backer of this organization, I ordered a comprehensive independent audit of the foundation's books. What you are looking at behind me is the unvarnished, undeniable reality of where your charitable donations have actually gone. I clicked the remote. The screen shifted to a deeply incriminating ledger. "This foundation operates with an 85% administrative overhead," I stated, surgically gesturing to the damning numbers. "Your donations did not go to community outreach. Your money went directly into offshore shell accounts managed by Yvonne Washington and her son-in-law, Connor Blackwood." The murmurs in the crowd morphed into loud, angry gasps. The mayor's wife, who had just been chatting amiably with Yvonne minutes ago, physically recoiled from her, taking 3 large steps backward in sheer disgust. I clicked the remote again. A series of highlighted explicit receipts filled the screens. $50,000 of your community funding was used to pay the initiation fee for the Oak Ridge Country Club. I continued, not allowing Yvonne a single second to recover. $15,000 was funneled through a phantom vendor to purchase a designer handbag for Chloe Blackwood. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of your charitable goodwill have been systematically drained to fund luxury vehicles, international vacations, and a completely fabricated lifestyle. Yvonne finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. She lunged forward toward the edge of the stage, her face contorted into an ugly, desperate mask of panic. "She is lying!" Yvonne screamed, her voice cracking hysterically. "Turn those screens off. This is a jealous, vindictive attack. She forged those documents to ruin me. Someone call security and have her removed right now." No one moved to help her. The security team, hired and paid for by my company, remained perfectly still at the perimeter of the room. The wealthy donors simply stared at Yvonne with unmasked contempt. They were looking at their own cleared checks projected on the screens next to receipts for luxury spa treatments. The evidence was irrefutable. I looked down at the woman who had spent 35 years making me feel completely worthless. "This gala was funded by my company to support real women of excellence," I said, my voice dropping to a register of cold, absolute finality. "Yvonne, your foundation is a sham, just like your love for me." At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom burst open. The dramatic entry drew the attention of the entire room. 10 men and women wearing dark suits and tactical windbreakers walked swiftly into the gala. The bold gold lettering on their jackets read, "District Attorney Investigations Unit." They moved with coordinated military precision, parting the crowd of stunned socialites and marching directly down the center aisle toward the stage. Yvonne spun around, her eyes widening in absolute horror as the lead investigator approached her. He did not care about her emerald gown or the expensive setting. He pulled a thick stack of folded documents from his interior pocket. "Yvonne Washington," the investigator stated loudly, ensuring the entire room heard him. "We are executing a final set of warrants for your immediate arrest on multiple counts of charity fraud, wire fraud, and grand larceny." Yvonne let out a piercing, shattered wail. She collapsed onto her knees, sobbing wildly and grabbing at Chloe's dress. But Chloe ripped herself away desperately, trying to distance herself from the radioactive fallout of her mother's crimes. The investigators hoisted Yvonne to her feet, snapping heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed loudly over the silence of the horrified ballroom. I stood on the stage and watched them march her out through the sea of the very people she had stolen from to impress. The empire of lies was officially dead. The dominoes fell with terrifying, unprecedented speed in the weeks that followed. Connor Blackwood was federally indicted on 34 counts of corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. His trial was a media spectacle that ended with him facing a mandatory minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The venture capital firm was completely liquidated by my attorneys, stripping him of every last asset he had ever claimed to own. Chloe, entirely stripped of her designer lifestyle and rendered completely penniless by the asset freezes, immediately filed for divorce to save herself. But there was no money left to save. The banks foreclosed on her sprawling mansion, repossessed her luxury vehicles, and seized her jewelry. She was forced to pack what little she had left into garbage bags and move into a cheap, rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. Yvonne was completely shunned by the society she worshipped. Her country club membership was publicly revoked, her former friends actively testified against her to the district attorney, and she was facing a significant prison sentence for running her charity as a massive criminal slush fund. The pristine suburban colonial she loved so much was legally seized by my holding company. It was a Tuesday afternoon when they finally hit absolute rock bottom. I was sitting behind the massive desk in my corner office on the top floor of the Washington Tech Solutions headquarters. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding, sweeping view of the city skyline. My assistant buzzed my intercom, her tone highly professional but laced with clear hesitation. "Ms. Washington," my assistant said, "your mother and sister are in the lobby. Security stopped them, but they are refusing to leave. They are demanding to see you." "Send them up," I replied calmly. "Have Keisha escort them into my office." A few minutes later, the heavy glass doors swung open. Keisha, my imposing head of security, stepped inside and gestured for them to enter. Yvonne and Chloe looked absolutely destroyed. The arrogant, pristine women who had mocked my clothing and my career were entirely gone. Yvonne was wearing a wrinkled, outdated blazer, her hair unstyled and her face haggard from sleepless, terrified nights. Chloe looked even worse, her posture slumped and her eyes red and puffy from endless crying. They stood awkwardly on the plush carpet of my office, looking around at the sheer, undeniable scale of my success. Maya Yvonne choked out, stepping forward and clasping her hands together in a gesture of pathetic, desperate begging. Please, we have absolutely nothing left. The lawyers are threatening to drop our cases. We are going to end up on the street. You have to help us. Chloe began to sob loudly, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. We are starving, Maya. I am living in a motel that smells like mold. Connor is gone. We have no one else to turn to. Please, we are blood. You cannot just let your own family die in the gutter. I sat back in my leather ergonomic chair, resting my hands perfectly still on the glass surface of my desk. I looked at their tear-stained faces, listening to them use the very word they had denied me my entire life. Family. You are right, I said, my voice quiet and even. We are blood. And I remember exactly how this family treats its own in their darkest hours. I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a crisp, standard white envelope. I placed it on the glass and slowly slid it across the desk toward them. Yvonne's eyes lit up with sudden, desperate hope. She lunged forward and snatched the envelope, tearing it open with trembling fingers. She reached inside and pulled out 2 printed pieces of paper. Her face instantly dropped, twisting in confusion and mounting horror. She looked at the papers, then looked up at me. These are bus tickets, Yvonne whispered, her voice shaking. Greyhound bus tickets, I corrected smoothly. Valid for travel anywhere outside of this state. I stood up, buttoning my tailored blazer, projecting an unyielding, towering authority. When I was 18 years old, I reminded them, my voice cold as ice. I came to you crying, starving, and begging for help to pay for college so I wouldn't end up on the street. You looked me dead in the eyes, handed me a $200 bus ticket, and told me to figure it out because I was a failure who was dragging down your aesthetic. Yvonne and Chloe stared at me in stunned, horrified silence. The memory hit them like a physical blow. I figured it out, I said, gesturing to the sprawling corporate empire visible through my office windows. I am simply returning the favor. Take the tickets, get on a bus, and figure it out. Yvonne opened her mouth to scream, to curse me, to unleash the toxic venom she had relied on for decades, but I did not give her the chance. I looked at my head of security. Keisha, I commanded, escort them out of my building permanently. If they ever step foot on my property again, have them arrested for trespassing. Keisha stepped forward, her hand resting firmly on her tactical belt. Let's go, ladies, she ordered, her voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. They had no fight left in them. Stripped of their stolen wealth, their fake status, and their toxic power, they were nothing. They turned and walked out of the glass doors, clutching their bus tickets, disappearing into the elevator and out of my life forever. Later that evening, the vibrant hues of the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and violet. I was sitting on the wide, beautifully renovated wraparound porch of Silas's home. The peeling paint and rotting wood were entirely gone, replaced by pristine, sturdy craftsmanship. The garden was immaculate, blooming with fresh, colorful flowers that swayed gently in the warm evening breeze. Silas sat in a plush rocking chair next to me, a warm, contented smile resting on his weathered face. He looked healthier and happier than he had in years, entirely safe from the predators who had tried to consume him. I took a slow, relaxing sip of my ice-cold sweet tea, feeling the condensation drip down the glass. The air was quiet, completely void of the shrieking, chaotic toxicity that had defined my early life. I looked out over the peaceful neighborhood, reflecting on the long, grueling journey. I had not just survived being the family scapegoat. I had taken the heavy, jagged stones they threw at me for 30 years and used them to meticulously build an impenetrable empire. The ultimate revenge was never just about seeing them destroyed. Their destruction was simply the necessary clearing of the debris. The true victory, the absolute triumph, was the profound, unshakable peace I felt sitting on this porch. I had won my life back, and for the first time the future was entirely mine to write. The powerful story of Maya teaches us that our true worth is never defined by the toxic people who try to break us down. When family members choose greed and manipulation over unconditional love, we must find the courage to walk away. Real power does not come from stooping to their level of cruelty, but from building an independent life grounded in integrity and self-respect. True success is the best response to those who underestimate you. By refusing to play the victim, Maya transformed her deep pain into an unstoppable empire, proving that inner peace is the ultimate revenge. If this story inspired you to claim your own worth, please hit the like button and subscribe for more empowering journeys.